What happens when royalty meets reality television and the clash becomes so explosive that security has to get involved? In just 31 seconds, a single comment would turn a routine interview into the most talked about television moment of the year. It started like any other evening on the show. The studio lights were bright, the audience was buzzing with anticipation, and Greg Gutfeld sat behind his desk with that knowing smile he always wore. He had built his reputation on asking the tough questions, the ones other hosts were too afraid to touch. Tonight would be no different. Meghan Markle walked onto the set in a designer outfit that probably cost more than most people make in a month. The audience applauded politely as she settled into the guest chair, crossing her legs and flashing a practiced smile. Greg leaned forward, his expression friendly but focused. "Welcome to the show," Greg said, his voice warm. "Thanks for joining us tonight." "Thank you for having me," Meghan replied, her tone measured and careful. The first few minutes went smoothly enough. Greg asked about her recent projects, her charity work, the usual softball questions that guests expect at the beginning of an interview. Meghan answered each one with the polish of someone who had done 1,000 interviews before. But anyone watching closely could see the tension building. Her smile was just a bit too tight. Her answers were just a bit too rehearsed. Then Greg shifted gears. "Let's talk about something people are really curious about," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You've spoken a lot about wanting privacy, about wanting to live a normal life, away from the spotlight. But you're also doing interviews, podcasts, documentaries. Some people might say that seems contradictory. How do you square those two things?" The studio went quiet. The audience could feel the shift in energy. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the moment when things got real. Meghan's smile faltered for just a second before she recovered. "I think there's a difference between wanting privacy in your personal life and using your platform to speak about important issues," she said, her voice taking on an edge. "Just because I don't want photographers following my children doesn't mean I should stay silent about things that matter." "That's fair," Greg nodded. "But when you sign deals worth millions of dollars to share your personal story, aren't you inviting that scrutiny? Aren't you commodifying the very privacy you claim to want?" The audience murmured. This was classic Greg, cutting through the talking points to get to the heart of the matter. Meghan shifted in her seat. "I think you're oversimplifying a very complex situation," she said, her voice cooling. "You don't understand what it's like to have every aspect of your life dissected by the media." "You're right, I don't," Greg said calmly. "But I also don't do interviews complaining about media attention while actively seeking media attention. That's the part people find confusing." "Excuse me?" Meghan's eyes narrowed. "Are you saying I'm being hypocritical?" "I'm saying there seems to be a disconnect between what you say and what you do," Greg replied, his tone still even. "And I think that's a fair observation." The temperature in the room was rising. You could see it in the way Meghan gripped the armrest of her chair, in the way her jaw tightened. "I came here expecting a respectful conversation," she said, her voice sharp now, "not to be attacked by someone who clearly has an agenda." "An agenda?" Greg raised his eyebrows. "My agenda is asking questions. That's literally my job. If the questions make you uncomfortable, maybe that's something to think about." "Your questions aren't making me uncomfortable," Meghan shot back. "Your rudeness is making me uncomfortable." The audience was completely silent now, watching this exchange like a tennis match. Greg remained calm, his posture relaxed. "I haven't been rude," he said simply. "I've been direct. There's a difference. If you want to come on television and tell your story, you have to be prepared for people to question that story. That's how this works." "That's not how respect works," Meghan said, her voice rising. "You don't get to sit there in your comfortable little chair and judge my life when you have no idea what I've been through." "I'm not judging your life," Greg countered. "I'm questioning your choices. Again, there's a difference." Meghan stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. The audience gasped. This was not in the script. This was not how these interviews were supposed to go. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice loud enough to echo through the studio. "I don't have to sit here and be disrespected by someone who clearly doesn't understand anything about my situation." Greg remained seated, his expression unchanged. "Asking questions isn't disrespect," he said calmly. "If you can't handle basic scrutiny, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews." "Basic scrutiny?" Meghan's voice went up another octave. "You've been attacking me since I sat down." "I've been asking you questions," Greg repeated, his voice still level. "If you interpret questions as attacks, that says more about you than it does about me." The crew members were looking at each other nervously. The producers in the booth were frantically trying to figure out what to do. This had never happened before. Guests didn't just stand up and start yelling in the middle of an interview. "You know what your problem is?" Meghan said, pointing her finger at Greg. "You're so desperate to be controversial, to get ratings, that you'll say anything. You don't care about truth. You don't care about people. You just care about your show." Greg finally stood up, but his movements were slow and deliberate. "My problem?" he said, his voice still remarkably calm. "I'm not the one yelling, right now. I'm not the one who agreed to come on this show and is now throwing a tantrum because I asked basic questions." "A tantrum?" Meghan's face was flushed now. "How dare you? You invited me here under false pretenses. You said this would be a friendly conversation." "I said it would be a conversation," Greg corrected. "I never said I wouldn't ask you real questions. That's not how journalism works, even on a show like this." "This isn't journalism," Meghan spat. "This is a hit job." "A hit job would be me bringing up all the things I haven't mentioned," Greg said, his tone sharp now for the first time. "The staff members who've complained about working with you, the family members who won't speak to you anymore, the fact that every organization you touch seems to have problems afterwards. I've been actually quite gentle with you." The audience was riveted. Some people had their phones out, clearly recording this. The producers had given up trying to cut to commercial. This was live television gold, even if it was a complete disaster. "You don't know anything about my family," Meghan said, her voice shaking with anger. "You don't know anything about what happened." "I know what everyone else knows," Greg replied. "What you've chosen to share publicly. And I know that there are two sides to every story, but you only seem interested in telling yours, because my side is the truth." "According to you," Greg said. "But the thing about truth is that it doesn't usually require a $1 million Netflix deal to tell it." That was the breaking point. Meghan's face went from flushed to pale. Her hands were trembling. "I want to leave," she said suddenly. "Get me out of here." "You're free to go any time," Greg said, gesturing toward the exit. "Nobody's keeping you here." "You're all the same," Meghan said, her voice breaking now. "All you journalists, all you media people. You don't care about destroying lives. You don't care about the damage you cause. The only person causing damage right now is you," Greg said quietly. "To yourself." Meghan grabbed her purse from beside the chair. Her hands were shaking so badly, she almost dropped it. A producer rushed onto the set, trying to calm things down, but Meghan pushed past him. "Don't touch me," she snapped. "I'm leaving." "Before you go," Greg called out, "maybe think about why a simple interview made you this upset. Maybe the problem isn't everyone else. Maybe it's the story you're trying to sell." Meghan whirled around, her eyes blazing. "You want to know what my problem is? My problem is people like you. People who think they can say whatever they want without consequences. People who hide behind their microphones and their cameras while they tear other people down." "I haven't torn you down," Greg said, his voice firm. "You came on this show. You agreed to this interview. I asked you questions. If you can't handle that, if you can't defend your own choices, that's on you." "Not defend my choices?" Meghan's laugh was bitter. "To you? You're not worth my time. And yet, you came on my show," Greg pointed out. "You wanted this platform. You wanted this audience. Now you're upset because it didn't go the way you scripted it in your head." The audience was completely silent. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others looked fascinated. Everyone was watching to see what would happen next. "You think you're so smart?" Meghan said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You think you're some kind of truth teller, but you're just another bully with a platform." "If asking you to explain yourself is bullying, then I don't know what to tell you," Greg said. "Maybe get used to it, because the world isn't going to stop asking questions just because you want it to." Meghan took a step toward the desk, and for a moment, it looked like she might actually try to confront Greg physically. Security guards who had been standing off to the side moved forward slightly, ready to intervene if necessary. "You have no idea what it's like," Meghan said, her voice low and intense, "to have everyone judge you, to have everyone think they know you." "You're right. I don't," Greg said. "But I do know that if you can't handle being asked about your own words and actions, maybe you should stop talking publicly about them." "I have a right to tell my story." "And I have a right to question it," Greg replied. "That's how this works. You don't get to control the narrative once it's out there." Meghan stood there for a long moment, breathing heavily, clearly trying to decide what to do next. The entire studio held its breath. "This interview is over," she finally said. "It was over the moment you stood up," Greg agreed. "But you're the one who ended it, not me. Remember that." "I'll remember that you're a horrible person," Meghan shot back. "I can live with that," Greg said with a shrug. "Can you live with walking off a set because you couldn't answer basic questions?" Meghan opened her mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. She turned on her heel and marched toward the exit, her heels clicking loudly on the studio floor. The security guards followed at a discreet distance. Greg waited until she was almost at the door before speaking again. "Ladies and gentlemen, Meghan Markle," he said dryly. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or stay silent. A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd. Meghan stopped at the door and turned back one last time. "You're going to regret this," she said, her voice carrying across the studio. "I doubt it," Greg replied. "But you might. Walking out tends to make people look like they have something to hide." "I have nothing to hide," Meghan shouted. "Then why are you leaving?" Greg asked simply. That question hung in the air. Meghan stared at him, her chest heaving with emotion. Then, without another word, she pushed through the door and disappeared. The studio erupted. Some people were clapping, others were talking excitedly to their neighbors. The energy was electric. This was the kind of moment that people would be talking about for weeks, maybe months. Greg sat back down at his desk, straightening his notes as if nothing unusual had happened. "Well," he said to the camera, a slight smile playing at his lips. "That was interesting." The audience laughed, the tension breaking like a wave. "We'll be right back after this break," Greg continued, his tone casual. "And maybe our next guest will actually stay for the whole interview." More laughter. The show cut to commercial, and the staff immediately began buzzing about what had just happened. Cameras had captured everything. The moment Meghan stood up, the pointing finger, the shaking hands, the dramatic exit. Every second was recorded and would be replayed endlessly. When they came back from commercial, Greg addressed what had happened head on. "So, that happened," he said, looking straight into the camera. "And I want to be clear about something. I didn't ambush anyone. I didn't ask anything that wasn't fair game. If you come on television to talk about your life, to promote your projects, to tell your story, you have to expect questions. You have to expect scrutiny. That's not disrespect. That's journalism." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Now, some people are going to say I was too hard on her. Some people are going to say I was rude. But I want you to watch that interview again. I want you to listen to what I actually said and how I said it. I never raised my voice. I never insulted her. I asked her to explain herself. That's it. And apparently, that was too much." The audience applauded, and Greg nodded in acknowledgement. "Here's the thing about public figures," he continued. "They want the platform. They want the attention. They want the money and the fame that comes with being in the spotlight. But they don't want the responsibility that comes with it. They don't want to be held accountable for their words and actions. They want to be able to say whatever they want and have everyone just accept it without question." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "But that's not how it works. That's not how it should work. If you're going to use your platform to make claims, to tell stories, to influence public opinion, then you need to be prepared to back those claims up. You need to be prepared to answer tough questions. And if you can't do that, if you can't handle basic scrutiny, then maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews." The applause was louder this time. Greg had clearly struck a chord with his audience. "I've been doing this job for a long time," he said. "I've interviewed hundreds of people, politicians, celebrities, activists, regular people with extraordinary stories. And you know what? Most of them can handle tough questions. Most of them can defend their positions. Most of them understand that an interview is a conversation, not a coronation." He paused again, his timing perfect. "But every once in a while, you get someone who thinks they're above it all. Someone who thinks they should be able to say whatever they want without anyone pushing back. Someone who thinks that asking questions is the same as being attacked. And when that happens, well, you saw what happens." The audience was hanging on his every word now. "Look, I get it," Greg said, his tone softening slightly. "Being in the public eye is hard. Having your life scrutinized is hard. I'm not saying it isn't. But nobody forced her to do this interview. Nobody forced her to come on this show. She chose to be here. And when things didn't go the way she wanted, when I didn't just nod along and agree with everything she said, she chose to leave. That was her decision." He looked directly into the camera again. "So, no, I don't regret asking those questions. I don't regret doing my job, and I'm not going to apologize for expecting someone to be able to defend their own narrative. That's not too much to ask. That's the bare minimum. The studio audience gave him a standing ovation. Greg smiled and nodded, clearly pleased with their response. "All right, let's move on," he said, gesturing for everyone to sit down. "We've got a great show lined up for you." Our next guest actually agreed to stay for the entire interview, which is nice. Laughter filled the studio once more. Behind the scenes, producers were already fielding calls from news outlets wanting to know what had happened. Social media was exploding with clips of the confrontation. Everyone had an opinion. Some people thought Greg had been too harsh. Others thought he had been perfectly reasonable. Some people defended Meghan, saying she had been ambushed. Others said she had embarrassed herself by walking out. But one thing was clear. This moment, this confrontation, had touched a nerve. It wasn't just about one interview or one guest. It was about something bigger. It was about accountability. It was about whether public figures should be able to control their own narratives or whether journalists should be free to question those narratives. Greg had made his position clear. He believed in asking tough questions. He believed in holding people accountable, and he wasn't going to apologize for it, regardless of who got upset. As the show continued, Greg interviewed his remaining guests with the same direct, no-nonsense approach he always used. He asked probing questions. He challenged assumptions. He didn't let anyone off easy, and his audience loved him for it, because at the end of the day, that's what they tuned in for. They didn't want softball interviews where guests got to spout their talking points unchallenged. They wanted real conversations. They wanted to see people pushed out of their comfort zones. They wanted to see what happened when someone actually asked the questions everyone was thinking. And tonight, they had gotten exactly that. They had watched a carefully constructed public image crack under pressure. They had seen what happened when someone who was used to controlling the conversation suddenly lost that control. They had witnessed a moment of raw, unscripted television that reminded everyone why live TV could be so compelling. The interview had lasted less than 15 minutes before Meghan walked out. But those 15 minutes would be dissected and analyzed for much longer. Every word would be examined, every facial expression would be scrutinized, every moment would be replayed and debated. Greg had done what he always did. He had asked questions. He had pushed back. He had refused to let someone use his show as a platform for unchallenged claims. And in doing so, he had created one of the most memorable moments in television. As the show wrapped up and the audience filed out, people were still talking about what they had witnessed. Some were pulling out their phones to watch the clips again. Others were already posting their reactions online. Everyone had something to say. In the green room, Greg's team gathered around him, congratulating him on handling the situation with such composure. He shrugged it off, as he always did. "I just did my job," he said simply. "Ask questions. That's it." But everyone knew it was more than that. In an age where celebrities and public figures often got to control their own narratives, where interviews were carefully managed and questions were screened in advance, Greg had done something different. He had treated his guests like anyone else. He had asked the questions that needed to be asked, and he had done it without backing down, even when things got heated. The video clips of the confrontation spread rapidly. Within hours, millions of people had watched Meghan stand up and point her finger at Greg. They had heard her accusations, they had seen her dramatic exit, and they had watched Greg remain calm and composed. Throughout the entire ordeal, public opinion was divided, as it always is. But one thing was undeniable. Greg had maintained his integrity. He had stuck to his principles. He had done what he believed was right, regardless of the consequences. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not whether everyone agreed with him, not whether Meghan would ever speak to him again, but whether he had been true to himself and true to his audience. He had been. In that moment, that confrontation had proven it beyond any doubt. When pushed to choose between asking tough questions and making a guest comfortable, he had chosen the questions, every time, without hesitation. That was what made him good at his job. That was what made his show successful. And that was what made this moment so powerful. Because in a world where so many people were afraid to speak up, afraid to challenge the narrative, afraid to ask the hard questions, Greg had shown that it was still possible, it was still important, and it was still worth doing, no matter who walked off the set.